Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at CSIS. I've got two great panelists for what will be a conversation today on technology, entrepreneurship, and Southeast Asia. So first is Jenny Lee, a managing partner at GGV Capital, who focuses on a lot of the areas that we just love at CSIS: Fintech, robotics, AI, and EdTech, which we haven't done that much work on. So thank you for coming on. She, of course, is a graduate of an aerospace company and Morgan Stanley and others, and went to Northwestern, where I used to live right down the street from there when I was in Chicago. So welcome, fellow Evanstonian. Along with Jenny, we have Lim Yu-hung, the regional head of public affairs at Grab. We'll talk about Grab during the interviews. He's ex-managing director at partner at Boston Consulting, also did a lot of work in various startups and with the Singapore Ministry of Transport. So he focuses on strategy, transformation, digital industries, and that would be the topics we're going to cover. I'm going to start by asking you both about Southeast Asia, which was what we were talking on right before the call started. Tell us about the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Southeast Asia. Tell us how it compares to others, its strengths, its weaknesses. You know, one of the things that we were saying is people may not be aware of how much Southeast Asia has changed and how much the entrepreneurial and innovation community has grown. So, Jenny, why don't I start with you? Tell us about it.
Yeah, sure. So the Southeast Asia market is what at GGV we term the next billion users target market. And, over the last 20 years, we've seen growth in the US, in China, and over the next 5 to 10 years, we expect Southeast Asia to really come up. And primarily on a couple of factors, right? I think number one, it's for when it comes to entrepreneurship, it's always about the talent pool. And so over the last, particularly over the last 5 years, we've definitely seen an acceleration and growth of the early startups. And with these startups getting into unicorn status, it's also helping to train that current and next generation of talent. And across, and Yu-hung can talk about Grab, obviously has contributed to a lot of the training of this internet talent, and alongside with other recent unicorns that's gone public in the US and Asia market, the Razer, the Garena, the Sea of the World, that's also contributed to the talent pool. So with the talent pool, with the success of unicorn, super unicorn status, I think it's also set a very good precedence to say, in Asia culture, parents always say, go study, get a degree, and then go either be a lawyer, a doctor, engineer, or a accountant, right? And today it's actually cool to be an entrepreneur because you could be, like an entity, right? Who founded Grab years ago. So I think the whole cultural mindset has changed. And it's not just the talent pool, it's the general environment. And therefore, with that, we address the first issue, talent. And, alongside with that, I think the government, and we can talk about this later as well, further, accelerated by COVID, is also getting on in terms of policies, in terms of regulation, in terms of support to bring in the talent, to promote the entrepreneurial spirit, not just by the startups, but also for corporates to participate. In Asia, you always hear about this, corporate interaction with venture, right? Corporate interaction with entrepreneurship. And I think that's the role of government also coming in to say, let us have this three-party relationship, the government, the corporates, and the startup. So I think the environment then has to be, good enough to support that infrastructure. And along with that as well, we have a lot of other emerging trends, which we can also touch on later as well.
Yu-hung, what do you think of the environment? You are an entrepreneur, so is Jenny, but tell us about it.
So I think Jenny's right to talk about the talent as an essential ingredient. I think a lot of us who were interested in tech when we were growing up had to had to be in US or in Europe to take part in that. I think what has really changed is that talent pool is coming back to Asia, and it's also attracting global talent. In Grab, we have talent from, I think, something like 50, 60 countries, and all serving in markets in Southeast Asia. So talent, I think, is a key ingredient that has really changed. I think the second thing that has also changed is capital, right? I think in the past, people don't really think about Southeast Asia as a tech investment destination. And when we started 8 years ago, I think we were one of the few that were starting to get those capital in, and with the growth of these unicorns such as ours, you start to see more and more capital coming in, and with the recent geopolitical trends, you also see tech companies from the US and China taking a more interest into Southeast Asia. So it is also a place where capital is coming in. And I think the last ingredient that sort of driving the growth of entrepreneurship and tech in Southeast Asia is I guess confidence. I think there are examples now of really successful companies being being growing out of Southeast Asia. And I think that confidence really, is reinforcing, talent, then attracting talent, attracting capital. And I think we're now in a good part of the cycle where, everything is coming together, and we do see quite a bit of growth in this area.
Both of you mentioned talent. What kind of talent? What are you looking for? And of course, the company will have a mix of people, but what's the talent that you said is so important here for this? Jenny, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Sure. So I think that it really depends on the companies that we're talking about. And today what we have seen an acceleration is it's really the how internet or how AI technology, new technology is disrupting traditional industries. It could be in fintech, could be government tech, could be education tech, could be in automation. And so as you go across that spectrum of disruption that we're seeing, happening within the verticals, the level of talent required is different, and therefore the depth is different. I would say that when we talk about, the really increasing pool and more matured pool of talent, it's primarily on the internet side, right? And so whether it's the influx, the returnees coming back from the US, coming from China, or locally grown, what we have seen first in the last 5-10 years really is on the internet side, right? So the Grab of the world, the Garena of the world, the Sea of the world, this is correspondingly in ride sharing, in payment, in e-commerce, and in gaming, right? And so I think that those are the internet talent that we have seen. And so the experience to have built, great client software, back-end infrastructure to support, multi-million users coming together, those are the depth of experience, because Asia as a region is not homogeneous. And because of that, the network quality is vastly different from if you were to do a startup in the US or in China, where you're facing with the same, technology stack, right? So I think that's where we have seen great sign of that maturity in talent, which is to tackle specific regional issues on the internet, on the tech side. And in other areas, I think where we talked about whether it's robotics, automation, fintech, edtech, I think those are areas where when it cuts the vertical deep and there's content, there is scenario-based industries, we still need to have the industry guys really jumped in and said, I don't have to work for a big MNC. I don't have to work for a blue chip. Let me take those experience and now let's go help the startup to bridge the gap between the knowledge of leveraging technology to disrupt those workflow. So I would say I would classify it as different level, but all moving in the right direction.
Yuhang, tell us about Grab. I mean, tell us the Grab story from startup to unicorn.
So we started actually with a very simple, about 8 years ago, with a very simple problem statement, which was to try to make public transport taxi services safer. That was the mandate by our co-founders, trying to offer ride-hailing services in Malaysia, where they see really a value proposition of providing safe and convenient service. And from ride hailing, we then expand into different things, into motorcycle hailings, right? And then on to food delivery, payment systems. And today we're talking about a full suites of transport services, delivery services, whether is it food or groceries, or parcels, to financial services, with its whole gamut of services. So over the years, we've sort of expand in terms of services, all with the theme of either providing conveniences, livelihoods to Southeast Asians, and providing conveniences, whether is it in terms of food, transport, or financial services. So the team is quite focused. The geography is also quite focused as well. We are a Southeast Asian player. We feel at home here. We understand the market very well. And so we are in the major markets in Southeast Asia. I think it's a journey that's been quite crazy. I've only joined a year and a half ago, and in that 1 year and a half, the company has changed as well. So I don't really know where we will go specifically. We have a true north, but I think along the way we'll morph a little bit. So it's going to be an exciting journey for us.
I want to come back later to the theme of autonomous vehicles, because I was thinking about the traffic in Singapore and Jakarta, not to say Bangkok, and wondering how that would work. But before we do that, let's talk about payment systems and fintech. I'm on some fintech mailing list, and I probably get 50 startups a week. It's a growth area. It's going to be disruptive. Jenny, you do a lot of work in fintech. What can you tell us about it in Southeast Asia and then globally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on the fintech side, we have seen a lot of very different model. I'm sure, Jim, you probably have seen similar ones. In the US and China, they tend to be, disruption mostly on the customer acquisition front, right? The Robinhood of the world that's trying to bring a different form of financial services, to the consumer. And I think those are the front-end companies. In China, we see similar, whether it's P2P companies, whether it's credit verification companies. The innovation that we have seen tend to be happening on that front end, the client-facing side. In Southeast Asia, the region is different. As I alluded to earlier, it is not a homogeneous region. It has many countries. It has very different currencies, different regimes, different regulation. But what's interesting is that the region is very mobile, right? And so you have immigrants, you have migrant workers. The trade flow is actually tremendous on the day-to-day basis. And so on the fintech side, where we do make investments and we pay quite a bit of attention, it's not just on the front end in terms of customer facing, in terms of providing services, to bring the underserved on to the financial, digital platform, but also at the tech layer. And so what do I mean, right? So on the tech layer, we're looking at companies that does interconnection, that can facilitate mobile wallet transfer, money transfer, currency change. And Asia is also very interesting in the sense that, let's watch out, right? The fight for the mobile wallet is on, and it's on in a very big way, right? Every country you go to, when you talk to a carrier or a bank or even startups, you have a lot of this innovation saying, I want to be the dominant mobile wallet. Right, China, we have our Alipay and the Tencent Pay, and I think in the US you can argue, is it Google or Apple Pay, or even the credit card companies. But in Asia, there is no dominant leader, and therefore, when you have all this innovation happening on the mobile wallet on the front end, but correspondingly to do this well, you need to have the back end. And given the fight of the mobile wallet, you're going to have fraud, right? And so along with that tech stack as well, we're also looking for companies that can now leverage technology to do better fraud detection, to protect your accounts, to protect your wallet, because those are important. So it's a lot richer. And I think actually very exciting, because we can potentially see, maybe world first innovative companies on the tech stack, on the fintech side.
If you had asked me, I would have said Alipay was dominant. You don't think they're dominant?
No, I think Alipay definitely wants to be a term of dominant. But, the crux of Alipay's success in China is really when they started early, they had a lot of merchants. And so it's the offline merchants that came on, whether it's through POS and then the virtual POS and 2D code. Then obviously the online e-commerce that really helps to pull through. But in new regions like in Asia, no one really have an advantage in that sense, right? Ali True Lazada definitely has a position on the e-commerce plate, but on the e-commerce player, I think the field is still a multi-horse race. I would say it's no dominant player yet, but we are definitely seeing some competing players trying to leverage a similar playbook that Ali has gone through. But we'll see, because once the playbook is known, it's typically hard to clone.
Yuhong, would you call yourself one of those horses in the horse race? I mean, you guys are getting into fintech, right? Or payment systems.
Yeah, so GrabPay is in all 6 markets, the key markets in Southeast Asia. We consider ourselves as one of the few wallets that are truly Southeast Asian. I would say we are a player. I would still say it's quite early days in the fintech space, part because the penetration in Southeast Asia is still quite weak. There's still many unbanked, underserved customers, and pain points of customers are still quite heavy. It's still there, right? So I would say that it's still a long way to go. I think we have done quite a bit of things to really sort of make it simple for consumers to get onto financial services, but it's still some way to go.
So the Monetary Authority of Singapore is a global leader in rule setting. What's the reaction of regulators been to the fintech enterprise? I've been in some meetings with central bankers, and the thing I came away with was a very deep sense that they are very cautious. So what are the regulators saying when you talk about these new initiatives?
So I think one is they are right to be very careful about this, because the banking sector is the backbone of Southeast Asia's economy, any economy, right? So I think governments are trying to understand fintech. It's a process, and it will continue to take time. The Singapore authority is probably at the forefront of trying to think about these and harness the innovation that's coming from fintech to really drive the growth of the financial services sector. I think it's a bit early days. There is no uniform regime across Southeast Asia. If there's one thing about it, it's very, very diverse, very different, right? And so for fintech companies trying to be successful in Southeast Asia, the number one thing is really trying to understand what's the local context and to localize that, and at the same time leverage on the scale that you need to have as a regional player. So it is a fine dance, but we do see, because it's quite complex, there is a space and a place for us to be competitive because of the complexity as well. So we don't see it always in a negative light, but like whoever who can manage that complexity would have a good start and quite a defensible position in Southeast Asia.
Jenny, when you hear that, what do you think about transitioning to a global market for these companies? Is that a goal, or is it doable? What are the steps that you would say take a Grab and make it global, or take one of these payment systems and make it global? What's the transition, if you even want it? What's the transition to a global market?
Yeah, so I think on that front, there are 2 layers, right? You alluded, I think a Grab has their hands full in Asia. Asia, if you own the market, would be the 3rd largest, right, after US and China. And so I would say that once you own the consumer on the front end, you could go from ride sharing, you could go for food delivery, you can go for payment. And so if you were to bunch some of those major unicorns in the China market, take a third of their market cap and combine them into a potential Grab, I think you get a very exciting unicorn potential in the region just by addressing the front end consumer. So I think for companies and startups that are looking at really value adding to the consumer front, if you can own the Southeast Asia market, you have a pretty sizable market, right? So again, I draw a different parallel to C. C is started on the gaming side and extended into Shopee on the e-commerce side. Today is close to 100 billion just serving the Asia market. So I think it is big enough to focus and make it, because of the complexity of the countries and local behavior. If you get that formula right, you're unbeatable, because the competitors from other markets will find it really hard to enter this area. Now, for the companies that can go global, I think it has to be technology. right? And so as I mentioned, I think companies that are doing interconnection, for money transfer, for currency exchange, that is a problem that we have seen in emerging economies. For example, in Africa, for example, in Latin America, right? Regions where you have multiple countries, migrant workers, different currencies again, and the lack of existing infrastructure. And so mobile is like a leapfrog. In that situation, then companies like that, we actually encourage them to go global. And so as a start, they can build their rails, they can build their back end on a global basis. And the more interconnected they are, the more they can enable these emerging economies to grow. So technically, different approach. But at the end of the day, it's really to ensure that they have a huge addressable market, and they can do it by having a good, productized technology that they can scale across the market.
Where does India fit into this? I mean, there's a clear advantage to having local knowledge. India is a tough nut to crack, though. Does India fit into either grab thinking or what you're talking about, Jenny? Big market.
So I think that on the consumer front, India is the next billion, right? Literally by itself, 1.2 billion. So I think that if you crack the code in India per se, it's like the next China in the making. So I wouldn't distract the entrepreneurs when they're talking about the India market, because India market is very complex. It is homogeneous, yet not homogeneous, right? When you talk about local languages, you have a few hundred of local languages. And so any apps that you see in India, it's not in English, right? The ones that does well, it's in like multiple different languages. So I think on the front end, again, if you alike, US is one region, China, Southeast Asia, that I think India is its own world. In terms of infrastructure, I think we're still doing work. The government has a lot more active role in terms of on the fintech side in India, and so with that, it may slow down innovation on the startup, right? So if the government comes out with a unified payment at the back end, then that actually wipes out the innovation that can happen on the startup, right? But it may move the country forward in terms of moving up the stack in terms of technology. So definitely a market to watch. But I wouldn't bunch it as an extension from the other markets as easily.
That's interesting. Yu-Hong, any thoughts on India, or do we want to talk about
certainly don't have
business
plans on India? And again, from my previous experience, very few foreign companies is successful in India. It's always a big market, but it's always very tough to enter and to make it your own. Just from my personal experience.
How has COVID affected your business? Has it been good for Grab? Has it been a problem?
It's been mixed, right? I think at the beginning it certainly was a perfect storm where because of lockdowns in Southeast Asia, our transport business was at 1.0, right? Because the entire city was shut down. Through the waves, we have gotten much better at managing that. The recovery of the transport business has also been better after each lockdown. So. But certainly the transport business hasn't fully recovered in some markets yet. On the other hand, it was quite lucky that we have a food business, and the food business was a counterbalance to that, right? So, and we do see actually when lockdown happens, the food volume picks up, and then when the lockdown gets a bit softer, the food business will come down a little bit, but then the transport business go up. So it's actually a pretty nice portfolio that we have going, and because of because of COVID, this drive towards digitization has also bring a lot of merchants who needed a nut to get onto platform, and that has been a win for us. E-payments have been a win for us because it's cleaner, it has less of a stigma during COVID. So I think there were some very short-term hits to the business, but if you sort of step back and think about it, it does really drive digitization of the different markets we have in Southeast Asia. And in a longer term, I think it has been a good push. But the short-term shocks were really, really painful. And we didn't, imagine you were in March and you see traffic at zero. Frankly, you don't know how long it's going to last. I think we're seeing it shorter than than what we were prepared for. So that's a plus. But middle of the year,
Yeah.
it was scary.
Even in the think tank business, we panicked last spring. So it's been good to see it change. Jenny, what's your thought on COVID?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of a different timeline and perspective, right? So we have 200 plus companies, and half of them in China, half in the US. And so I think that similar to what Yu-Heng mentioned, I think when COVID really hits full storm in first quarter, particularly in China first, things were at a pause, right? Factories stopped producing, workers were not getting back to work, companies were not operating. So definitely across the board, there were a scramble, right, to figure out a few questions to answer. How do you prolong the cash runway, right? How do you have efficient headcount reduction, cost cuts to focus on your core business so that you can figure out, when the market comes back again, you can take on those opportunities. So I would say the first reaction was very defensive, which is, how do you, buckle down the business to ensure that you have a longer runway? And then very interestingly, by March, April, we see China recovering. The factories operations were back to 60-70% capacity. In fact, by 1st of May, I would say the China operations is back to almost 90%. And that's where we then now starts to see a second phenomena. And the second phenomena is, the companies, most of the companies we invested in, they are internet tech enabled, right? They are tech companies. And so we now see a supercharged growth and adoption in a few areas. The first area where it's consumer facing, whether it's education tech, fintech, gaming, health tech, all that tech stuff that can, and activities that can happen online, at home, e-commerce, logistics. We have seen tremendous growth. It's like, if they were on this curve and we're expecting them to grow 2-3x a year, they were down like this. So there was no winter effect. Everything was summer back in kind of April timeframe. So the consumer businesses were really getting, and the conversation was about how do we now leverage this new adoption, new behavior change, to booster charge those businesses. That's one. The second area that we are seeing changes is on enterprise. All of a sudden, the small, medium-sized enterprise, the governments are saying, I need to digitize. If I'm not already there, I need to get ahead. If I'm at 50%, let me get to 90%. So across the board, I think companies that were, providing open source software, whether it's and remote office software, well, you look at similar companies like Zoom, that does support video conferencing. Those are then, you start to see that J curve going, because as enterprise figure out, COVID is there for the long term, right? This is not short term. This is really business continuity on a continuous basis. And therefore, then we see the second wave, which is on the enterprise. And then the last part is an area I'm really excited, personally is an area I lead, is on automation, right? About 90+% of factories are not automated in China. But today, when you have to try and figure out how to bring your workers back, it is no longer about the cost equation. It's not an ROI question. It's about safety. It's about compliance. It's about, complementary, workforce. And so the third leg that we are seeing is really the whole adoption around the mindset change around automation has a very critical complementary, workforce versus saying, let's just figure out what's the ROI on a per bot usage. So I think over time, we are seeing now service robots in restaurants, in hotels, all the way to mainly factories, which is also seeing that regeneration as well. So I think just to give you that sense, we see similar wave in the US now, right? We may be a quarter behind, but we are seeing similar wave, and it's happening very similar direction. And so I think lastly on Asia, I would say that on Asia, the first wave is where we are seeing on the consumer side. The enterprise piece has not really taken off yet. Hopefully, we will see that. And automation, I think, is part of the whole 5G infrastructure. It's, not quite an COVID directed impact right now, but I do feel that it is going to be a government-driven support on the longer term for Asia.
Hey, Yu-Heng, how does Grab see the market evolving with automation, building on what Jenny's talked about? And automation some people are afraid of it. I happen to think it's great, but what do you see the market evolving in reaction to this, particularly the market you're in?
For us,
I guess we have always been a tech company, so we automate a lot of things that anyway, right? So whether is it customer service, whether is it the way that we do batching and distribution, logistics, the drivers and the delivery partners are still human, and I think will still be human for a while to come. But the trend of digitizing, the trend of SMEs who has been a perennial problems for government trying to digitize have started to sort of really push away those inertia, and I think it's a good start. It needs to be pushed further, but it's at least a good start now. The other thing I think related to automation is actually this whole question about future of works, and I think that has changed quite a bit with COVID. One being, gig work being critical and as a source of income and livelihood. The other thing is, remote working and how that changes consumption patterns, right? So I think the verdict is still out about how COVID and sort of this whole definition of work and emergence of new work model is changing the society, and we are watching that quite carefully because it does mean new pain points and new business models that we can address, and it's something that we are looking quite closely into as well for opportunities.
What are the keys to automation? What leads a company to automate? I mean, what's the business decisions behind this? So what do you need to automate? When is it a good idea? Jenny, do you want to do that one first?
Well, I think, again, there are different layers, right? Yuheng refers to a lot of processes, right? Whether, processes and tech, right? If you are trying to match 1 million writes a day, you're not going to use human and an Excel file, right? So in that sense, the automation has to happen, with computers, with servers, algorithms. So I think that's the most common level of technology that we're seeing, right? Which is when you are creating or leveraging, large batch processing, real-time, low latency interactions, then the computer does a way better job than the human, right? And I think there are many examples of why we have to leverage, why technology is so prevalent. Is that today, our human processing power is not equivalent to the little simplest CPU chip that Intel is churning out from the factories. So I think that's one layer, work process. And then I think that the second layer that we are looking at, if we were to cast our prediction 5-10 years down the road, then we're talking about, I mentioned about, automation in the form of robotics, right? Where you leverage hardware. And so what we can see there is then you have this complementary workforce where there are areas that's not safe, right? There are areas that requires 24 hours, uptime. There are areas where, you can no longer find the human skilled workers who wants to continue to do that job, whether it's in cleaning, on the general end. And I'd like to give an example on that front of why, certain jobs are being preferred over other jobs, right? Like if you talk to a youngsters, 20 years old and said, do you want to be a Grab driver, versus a online teacher or, someone who works in the factory for the same salary, working in the factory picking mushrooms, for example, that's a choice that, a 20-year-old in China may have. That 20-year-old is not going to want to be in a factory picking mushrooms. Now, why I use mushrooms are favorite food, right? And it's a premium product, high margin, and they pay a lot. In fact, sometimes more than what you can get if you're a TD driver or you are an online teacher. But the youngsters don't want to do it, right? And so they prefer to be on the little bike doing food delivery, or they prefer to be online, right? With their online real-time live streaming gaming. They can be a streamer versus going to pick mushroom. In that sense, mushroom factories have to figure out how to do this better. So the form of automation is happening is that they use AI. They use machine learning to take pictures of mushrooms. There are 3,000 varieties. And based on that, be able to integrate that into, factory lines to do, picking of mushrooms 24 hours. Right. So the whole work process is also being changed because the labor force has a choice. And with now new innovation happening online, their choice is going to be either, driving around, having that freedom, going to be their live streamer. So I think that level of automation is happening. The last level of automation I think we talked about is, and Jim, you alluded to this, is autonomous the holy grail, right? Do we have to drive ourselves, right? Can we get the car to drive themselves? Can we get the planes to fly themselves? And so that's the biggest question mark in the world of transportation.
Mhm.
And I think that there are a lot of entrepreneurs actually putting their mind and their capital
Yeah.
trying to make that happen. And when that happens, I think then truly, the human force can really focus on, doing the cool stuff, and letting that repetitive, flow or process truly automate, from software computation all the way to an actual physical process.
Hey, Young, how does Grab assign its deliveries? Do you have a big whiteboard? Is it homebrew? Do you use Excel? I mean, how do you guys do it?
That's a huge AI machinery behind that I have, frankly speaking, zero clue about. And that is really very interesting sort of algorithms, and some of it's politicized as well, right? You do hear people sort of saying like, I suspect that the AI is not really being fair to me, and I don't seem to be getting allocated the jobs before. So interestingly, as a result of
Really? In
having
Singapore, you get that?
not in Singapore, but across Southeast Asia, right?
Okay.
Drivers, especially when it comes to COVID, where there was a lot more supply of people trying to get onto the platform, then
Sure.
there is always this question around, I don't seem to be getting enough jobs today. Is it because I'm not being favored, or is there something wrong with my app, and things like that? So I think behind that big block of black box called AI, there is also a need to really communicate very clearly what the AI can and cannot do, and what are the principles that we use to sort of run the
Yeah.
AI, so that because it's livelihood and people involved. So automation is interesting, but we want to make sure that it continues to be something that we use quite carefully. Yeah.
What would Grab tell somebody who is doing or designing an autonomous vehicle? What would you want to see? What's your advice to the developers, to the entrepreneurs?
I mean, for us,
Don't
it's very
crash.
for us, it's very simple. Safety and economics, right? So I think as long as we can get safety to the right levels, the economics have to make sense. And I also think that the transition has to be very carefully thought through. We have something like 9 million people on our platforms right now making deliveries, transport.
Wow.
A lot of them in the maybe the bottom half of the socioeconomic ladder, and a lot of them value the flexibility, single mothers, early retirees, people who have some disability of some form, cannot find other jobs, is on the platform. And I think society has to ask itself a question of, if we ought not, and not everyone is going to be able to become a data scientist if they can't drive Grab, right? So there will there will be a bunch of I think of the population that would be disrupted as we move from convention vehicles to EV and then to AV, and that process is going to be disruptive. I've no doubt that we can adapt as society, but the transition is going to be painful, and that's where I think government needs to watch out for, and to make sure that you both encourage the innovation, but you also manage the transition pain. It's not going to be easy, but I think we've always managed this transition across the different industrial revolution, right?
That might be a great phrase for policy: manage the transition pain. Jenny, what are you doing in autonomous vehicles? Is GGV investing in them? Do you work with them? What advice would you give to a autonomous vehicle company? And there are a lot of startups.
Yes, definitely. I think this is part of our smart tech vertical. And so we have invested in two-wheelers, electric scooters, four-wheelers, electric cars. We have even invested in a company that's now listed in the US, and autonomous flying plane. That's transporter. So I wasn't kidding when I talked about the pace of technology. We have seen them. We've been with these companies when they were young, and then evolve. So I completely agree. I think with Yu Heng, right? Any big disruptive change, when we migrated many centuries ago, from horse-driven carriages to four-wheeler cars, that's a big transition. The whole ecosystem changed, the roads has to be built, and the whole infrastructure changed. Definitely, I think in the long term, we see progress, right, on every front. But in the short term, the individual is the one that gets affected, right? So generally, how do you manage this progress? Because progress has to continue, right? It has to move forward, but moving forward and yet making sure that you bring the majority. If you can bring all of the population with you, that's perfect. But in the interim, there's definitely a lot of that pain and consideration. So coming back to Jim, your question, I think the when we work with our startups, I think we always said, if you're autonomous driving, your aim can be on L5, right, which is full autonomous, hands-free. You don't even need a steering wheel, right? No, don't think about the car when you go to full autonomous as the car it is today, right? It doesn't have to be. If you don't have a driver's seat, you don't need a driver's seat. So things may change in the evolution. But that change may take 20 years, 30 years, right? And so as a startup, you don't just go for L5 and nothing else. And so we actually talked about a lot about how, as technology move in stage from L2, L3, L4 to L5, can they leverage the technology to take small steps, right? And it could be in the form of for deliveries, for trucks, for long point-to-point defined situation. Because the other thing that is very true that Yu-Heng also mentioned is that we don't have general AI, right? There is no powerful computer that can be a holistic human being at this point, right? That can completely react to, last minute, instant situation. And so in that sense, AI needs to be curated and learned and matured over time. And so, mini cases, mini steps to make things work. Just to give another parallel on the autonomous flying plane, the CEO's, the founder's vision is really to address the Indonesia problem, right? If you cannot address issues on the ground, let's take it to the air, right? Let's take it to, another 10,000 feet above, where you can redefine the paradigm, and perhaps that's a way to solve an issue. Sometimes solving an issue is not just saying, give me an issue and I give it one box, right? It's really about saying, hey, let me look at it holistically, and perhaps we don't fight on this level, we fight on a different level. So in that sense, the ultimate vision for the founder was to do, basically transformation on a daily basis. But to get there, it's going to take a lot of changes: government, regulation, changing, interaction with the Air Aviation Authority of every country. And so what they have done, and this COVID was very interesting, they actually have morphed their technology, their autonomous plane, to do firefighting, for example, for high rises. They have using it to do a lot of rescue work, supplies distribution, logistics. So again, you have to survive, right, while you wait for that end game. And so as part of that, you can have portions and modules of your technology be very relevant to society, so that society learns, and whether it's consumer, government, all the players, gets to figure out what's the right way to insert this technology that can make or lessen the pain that all parties have to go through. So it's a very interesting direction that we are going to. And I just want to say that Southeast Asia is perfect for this type of disruption. Southeast Asia has a region, is a very old infrastructure setup, right? You go to every country you see. I think Singapore is a little bit of an exception. I think we've been moving up. There are still certain things that needs to be upgraded now, because we're into our 60 years, 70 years. But by and large, Asia infrastructure, whether it's public infrastructure, whether it's a lot of public service infrastructure, they are still old, right? And therefore, with the advance of 5G, with the advance of this new technology, there is a way to leapfrog that, bring the population along with you, and then be able to then compete with the other regions in terms of those services to the consumer. So huge opportunities there, but definitely it's about how to create the right situation. And I think I just throw in another thing. I've been spending some time because of COVID in Asia as well. And the one word I keep hearing about a lot in Asia is the word sandbox. Right? Nowhere else do I hear sandbox, but I think particularly in Singapore, I hear a lot of sandbox. It is the government way to say we are open. We are open, we welcome innovation, but let's figure out how to do it in a protected conservative environment first, and then if this works, we can have and replicate this. I think conceptually it's a great concept. I think it does allow for innovation to happen, but maybe under watchful eyes. But if it does happen, it has a chance to take off.
We got a question from the audience, but before I go to it, because it might be a business question, it prompted me to think of something, and this is a little off script, so you guys can just make it up, but we're seeing a whole set of really big IPOs, right? And a lot of them are in the tech space. In fact, most of the big IPOs are in the tech space. What's behind the IPOs? That's one. And two, are we dancing on the edge of another tech bubble? So I don't know which one you want to touch. Both of you have experience in this, both what you're doing now and what you've done before. So what drives the IPOs? Are we getting too close to a tech bubble?
Well, I can go first, right? In fact, today GGV has an IPO price getting the bell rang. In fact, may have rung as I'm sitting here. So we're early investor in Wish. So definitely, I think this year has been a blockbuster year of IPO for us. We count north of 10 IPOs just this year alone, despite COVID. And I think that there are a couple of things, right? One, definitely a lot of these companies are tech-enabled. As I mentioned earlier, we see it in the private companies. We also see it in the public companies. The large companies that have the resources are stepping on the gas big way, right? And so these are companies that brings, remote, that helps to supercharge remote work, cloud migration, e-commerce, consumer application. So, from the Peloton to the Wish, to the Zoom of the world, I think those are real fundamental behavioral change, which resulted in increased adoption and revenue, right? And so in that sense, the IPO market welcomes this, right? With the flush of liquidity that's been released into the market, it is one way to say, if you believe that this trend is going to be long term, then this is where the stocks have really attracted.
The flip side to that is WeWork, but that's a good question. I mean, you think the valuations are right generally?
So I think it's hard.
And Yuhan, we're going to come to you, so you better be thinking your answer up.
It's hard to opine on valuation because I think valuation is part expectation, right? And that expectation can be a 3 months expectation, 3 years expectation, 30 years expectation. I give a story. We invested in Alibaba back in 2003 at 180 million valuation, and back then it was the most expensive. It was the most expensive deal that we have on the private side. Today, this company is. I'm hearing echo actually.
Yeah, me too. Maybe we can do something about that. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Good.
Is it better now? Okay. Great.
Yeah.
So I think today, you can always guess. We were wrong when we guessed that Alibaba would tap out at the 10B. It continues to boost the charge, and then mobile disruption came on and it went past, the 100B, right? So again, I would say valuation is relative. Relative to growth, depends highly on execution down the road, and therefore, I wouldn't classify, us getting into a bubble because, I was making investments during the internet, .com, boom, and then of course the bust, right? Back then, the fundamental drivers were not present, right? So there was eyeballs, but
it was too early.
Monetization, absolutely. Today we are talking about revenue, we are talking about subscription, we are talking about users. So I think that fundamentally the demand is real. Now valuation, in the short term could be a little exuberant, but over the long term, I think it'll work itself out.
Yuhong, what do you think about that? I mean, you're sort of in the middle of it, but you've had experience before. IPOs, go ahead.
So I would say a few thoughts, right? One is I think COVID has really been sort of a bit of a bringing clarity about the value of tech companies and digital, and that drives a bit of that enhanced valuation and IPO activities that we are seeing now. So that really brings some clarity on that. And I think the second point is that it's also important to really recognize that the tech world is actually quite a broad sort of array of different tech business, right? They all have very different business model, and there is going to be some lemons there. There also going to be some really big hits there, and I think overall I think I'm quite bullish about it. But I guess if you're an investor, I think you need to watch out for some of the ones that may not have too robust. And I like to add also the last point is what Jenny has mentioned, right? If you look at some of the business fundamentals of the tech companies, it does make a lot of sense, right? They are solving real pain points. They are solving real pain points and getting compensated for that. And I think that the business model, the monetization model is actually quite critical. And I think it's something that companies like Grab thinks about all the time, because we want to make sure we are solving pain points. And I think that's the right way to go, right? Because if you're doing the right thing, solving the right pain points, and getting customer to recognize that, then the IPO story writes itself, right?
We did get a question about Grab and Gojek, which, if I remember correctly, it's an Indonesian company, kind of similar to you guys. You want to say anything about Grab and Gojek?
No, I can't comment on speculation, but it would be great to hear what Jenny thinks about the rumors.
Over to you, Jenny.
Well, not on specific, but I think that in China, we have seen that the market took a leap forward after Didi and Kuaidi merged, right? So once the merger, and from two perspectives, right? From the consumer perspective, you want as many players as possible because they love subsidies, right? Consumers love subsidies, drivers love subsidies. And so in the red hot competitive market to acquire customers, consumers, and drivers, it does help to have many players, right? And so, they hated it, when Didi and Kuaidi came together, right? From an investor perspective, it's the right way to go, because when companies comes together, you then now bring your level of attention and focus to service, right? You bring your focus then on building the right infrastructure for the long term versus the short term head-to-head crash and fight just to burn enough money, right? To acquire that user. So I think it allows companies, once they are merged, when Didi Kuaidi merge, to then now focus on the plumbing for the long haul, right? So I think from the company, from investor perspective, we like to see that the capital we invest does not just go to subsidize more consumer who runs away to the next shop when someone offers a better subsidies. So in the long term, I think that's what we like to see. I think if you said in Asia, what will work, we do feel that the market is not as big as China, US, but big enough. And so right now it's important to bring in the best talent, the best operations, have a good, huge service provider, and then have that service provider continue to make innovation in other ways, whether it's in food delivery, whether it's in payment. I think we talk about many of these other verticals that you can go to continue to create value for the consumer beyond that one-time subsidy that they get because they try to arbitrage between 2 or 3 service providers.
Maybe I add a bit on this point, less on the particular rumors, but sort of thinking about sort of market structure changing in Southeast Asia. I think there are a few driving forces behind it. One is what Jenny mentioned, sort of investors looking into making sure that their investments are getting the returns, and that the portfolio companies are focused on the right things. I also think the governments are thinking about it slightly differently, where they want to make sure they don't have too big and too powerful tech companies that becomes very hard to regulate. And there is some valid concerns on that point. And so that will be one considerations. And we already see some of these considerations coming in from the US and Europe, and to some extent in China as well. So I think that's the other driving force behind it. there is also, I think, again, the question about Southeast Asia being a market in which a lot of investors are interested in, and a lot of, you know, a lot of capitals is looking for ways to invest into Southeast Asia. It brings again into that means companies have longer runway as well. And there's also much good chance for a small company to become really big given the right financing. So they are all sort of working different things. They are working, and I therefore find it's very hard to predict how the structure would be going forward. But I know that there will be changes, and it's going to be quite a complex game.
So that might be a good closing out question. What do you guys see on the horizon for Southeast Asia when it comes to technology and entrepreneurship? What's your prediction for the near-term future? I'm not going to ask you. You can do 20 years out if you want. We won't hold you accountable. But what's your prediction for the future in Southeast Asia on these topics? Jenny, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think beyond just talking about trends and where the drivers are, I think in Southeast Asia, we're going to see more collaboration. If collaboration right now is at 90%, I think it will go to 110%.
What do you mean by collaboration? You mean between companies, between countries?
Between countries.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the biggest issue was before it was, individual countries considering, what they can do locally, regulation-wise across sectors. I think what COVID has shown is that none of these countries in Asia can really grow that well by themselves because we are so integrated on trade. We take like Southeast Asian regional travel for granted, right? It's like hopping on a bus. We go on this regional thing, and then all of a sudden COVID came, and we realized, oh my God, actually these are all different countries, and that you cannot, move trade. So whether it's goods flow, capital flow, people flow, those were all inhibited. And therefore, I do feel that, where we will see more attention is, and you're starting to see this already, right? More regional collaboration, more government level talks to say, can we create bubbles, right? You may start with travel bubbles, for countries that are safer, that has better control of COVID. But I think it will extend into areas where we talk about data, right? Data as a whole, how do you, data by country is not interesting because they are small. But data as a region, how do you better protect that? Whether it's data privacy consideration, sharing consideration, can you share medical data? Can you share, that's the most sensitive, right? So from e-commerce to medical, how do you do that collectively as a region? If the region can come together on these different fronts, and I believe the conversation is already starting, then I think we are going to see a whole new type of startups that will emerge that can work alongside, the government to figure out what's the right process, right? And I think I mentioned one example, right? Privacy computing, right? When you talk about data and you talk about that on the country level, you need to address, those layers of privacy and data consideration as well.
Great. Yu-Hong, last word to you. What do you think is coming up in the future?
I'm going to say something a bit more controversial. So, in Southeast Asia, the economy has typically been dominated by a couple of big conglomerates, and the economic growth is quite uneven, right? So you still have a huge income gap, and we are now at the crossroad of disruptions, right? You see the new unicorns coming up. A lot of them competing strong, and you could see some disruption in terms of some of these legacy companies maybe not becoming as competitive, and some of these tech companies picking up, right? And I think that we can be quite clear that some of these big tech companies would play a big role. The question is whether that changes the socio-economic fabric of Southeast Asia, whether that huge income gap continues, but you replace the old legacy companies with the new tech companies, but sort of behind it, it's the same. Or we could sort of say, look, we use this chance to also try to really build the middle class and try to bring it up, right? And I don't think the answer is being written, but I think there is an opportunity. And I think companies, not just Grab, but I think a lot of the companies and Jenny's certainly involved in that, is really trying to drive digitization, automation, so that better jobs are on the way, so that people can really make sort of a much more sustainable living. And I think that's the hope for Southeast Asia. I think that's a lot of potential. It's pretty chaotic place, but lots of potential. I think the next, what we do in the next 5-10 years would really sort of shape the economic structure of Southeast Asia for quite some time. So I think we are living in quite critical times, and therefore important to have those dialogue and conversations with governments, with civil society, to see how we can actually use technology for good, right?
Great, thank you. This has been a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground. There's more we could talk about, but we're at the hour mark. So Lim Yu Hong, Jenny Lee, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to everyone in the audience. We'll stay tuned to this topic. Talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.